Greetings. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, wrapped in a pandemic and full of turmoil of various kinds, economic, certainly political in the United States. Right now, Rush Limbaugh, right now, as we're broadcasting to you, is on the Rush Limbaugh show, is having Donald Trump on for the afternoon in what they call the world's largest virtual rally for the president. And just a few minutes ago, President Trump was saying to Rush and his 15 million or so listeners, we have a cure, not just a vaccine, we have a cure, based, I assume, on some experience he's had with his monoclonal antibodies and the like. Today, we're going to talk about the press, the pandemic, president, and the public, and how do you get sanity and progress amid such turmoil. I'm Andy Revkin, and I am building a new initiative on communication and sustainability at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, broadcasting from my home in the Hudson River Valley, and really pleased to have today with us three eminent journalists who have been dug in on issues of public health and peril and politics and science for many decades. Particularly wonderful to have Larry Altman today, who is an old friend from the New York Times, who has covered presidential health and was the first practicing physician to become a reporter. We'll find out a little bit about why he made that decision. And Laurie Garrett, who has been on the pandemic beat basically, not forever, since the 70s, won a Pulitzer Prize for her groundbreaking and gutsy coverage in Zaire of the Ebola outbreak there. And in 1995, basically wrote the book about what's happening right now, the coming plague. I think it was 95. Back in print, happily, or never out of print, but I'm sure surging these days. It's great to have you here again, Laurie. You've been on this show, I don't know, 10 times maybe. And Deborah Blum, another old friend from journalism circles, who now runs the Knight Center for Science Journalism at MIT, but after an illustrious career as a professor, University of Wisconsin, and as a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And it's great to have you here, Deborah, as well.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So I'm showing here to start two visions of journalism in the 20th and 21st centuries. Larry's, as far as I know, this was Larry's first presidential interview about health in 1980 from the New York Times archives. And of course, right now you go to the New York Times website and it's full of graphics and data. The line between journalism and science is getting murky because we have data journalists working directly with science in the newsroom. And I thought we'd start with Larry, just reflecting a little bit on where we are today. You know, having talked about presidential health since 1980 or before, you had also worked at the CDC. You were an editor of the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report.
With Charles Adams' title, if ever there was one.
I know. I just was talking to my wife about that last night. So, you know, when you wake up in the morning these days, what the hell do you think?
It's hard to. It's just overwhelming because on the epidemiological front, in terms of the COVID, I and hundreds and thousands of others have spread the word for decades that we were prone to another pandemic like the one of influenza 1918, 17, 18, 19. But we didn't know which bug it would be. We didn't know when it would come, and we didn't know where it would start. But we had to be on the alert for it. And I think that society as a whole, and medicine, public health, as subdivisions, have just failed miserably, totally flunked, and that's hurt society. And at the same time, we're having a presidential election where just days, a month before the election, the president succumbs to that new virus that's causing the pandemic in 2020, and defying all the scientific evidence about how he got it, how others would get it, why so many Americans have died from it, why so many more people around the world have uh, gotten it and died from it, and then, in my mind, lacks in terms of the prevention methods that should have been put in place months ago, last winter. And I had always, and I still am, argued for transparency in information about the health of political leaders, the president and others, particularly the elected officials. And we made a lot of progress in that when you look back on the times with Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and other leaders where we didn't know about their ailments. Not that it necessarily meant that they shouldn't be in power, but that the public had a right to know, because we hire presidents, senators, congressmen, congresswomen, mayors, whatever, to be our employees, to take care of our safety and welfare. And here we have the situation where when I started in, I thought that we should talk to the doctors and get their information about the candidates, talk to the candidates as well, because I thought that was equally important, and that this should be reported to the country. And this came in, the first time I got involved was 1972, after Senator Eagleton had to drop off the Democratic ticket as the running mate for Senator George McGovern, because he had not disclosed the fact that he had been hospitalized 3 times for depression and had electroshock therapy on 2 of those occasions. And then in 1980, when then Governor Reagan was running for president and campaigning, there were all sorts of questions because he would be the oldest person to become president. There were times when Reagan would say one thing at one time a day, contradicted at another time of the day, and cause confusion, and his rivals would even raise the question that maybe he was slipping mentally. In those days, the word was senile. Alzheimer's was not a household word. And Reagan, publicly said that his doctors would attest to his good health. And I and the Times challenged him. And it took a long time to get through his campaign, but he finally agreed to allow me to talk to the doctors he said he had gone to, and to interview him. And that led to the story that you see that Andy posted.
And think about that in the context of trying to get any kind of information that's reliable out of the current administration about presidential capacity or health. Maybe, Laurie, you've been on the front lines day by day, hour by hour, month by month.
But Andy, first of all, I want to honor that Larry really, I think, created the entire momentum that compelled political leaders to disclose about their health. No one was as insistent as he. And, every time there was an election year, I knew we were going to start hearing from Larry about they're not giving me their health data and their doctors aren't talking to us and they're hiding something. And I think I think before you really started being the voice on this, it was thought somehow distasteful, discourteous. How dare we be presumptuous enough to demand that a politician who wants to be the leader of the free world disclose whether or not they have underlying cardiac conditions, or they've been treated for stage 3 carcinoma at some point, or any of a number of other things that might contribute. And Larry really was the breakthrough guy on this. And we got to honor you for that.
I wish we had a cup to raise.
Yeah, really.
Oh, thank you.
It's true.
And where we are, I would just note that while Reagan supposedly was Alzheimer's free, that turned out not to be true. And we all remember that moment when he's in a live press conference and I forget which reporter asked him on camera a question, and his face just went completely and obviously blank. And we all audibly heard Nancy Reagan, the first lady, whisper, "We're doing everything we can." And then he said, "We're doing everything we can." And that was the moment when I think we all went back to dig up Larry's articles to find out what's wrong with the president. And he did indeed turn out to have Alzheimer's. And was it officially his cause of death, Larry?
Yes, but it's still unclear in my mind, even with interviewing Reagan in 80 and asking him what he would do if he, like his mother, had been, in his words, senile in her last years, and he said he would step down and resign.
Which he did not do.
Yes, but he said in that interview he expected his doctors to follow him, and he would go by whatever his doctors told him. And his doctors told me repeatedly that they did not see any signs of Alzheimer's, dementia, senility, whatever word you want to say the same thing. And I don't have any question with their honesty.
Well, of course, we couldn't really, even now, it's pretty difficult for a doctor to make a perfect diagnostic of Alzheimer's until it's post-mortem and you get in, you carve their great brain up. But back then, we had nothing except maybe a quick memory test.
But don't you think one of the issues is whether the doctors themselves are telling the truth? Certainly, you mentioned Wilson, Larry, and certainly Wilson post-stroke there was a massive cover-up of just how disabled he was. And you see, I wonder about it with Reagan and clearly today. Does anyone think that all of the presidents are being honest? I'd be curious as to your opinion.
Well, let me just say about Trump, if I may. One big difference between Trump and a lot of the other presidents we're referring to is that he has as far as we know, he has no private physician playing a key role. They're all in the chain of command. They're all active duty military personnel, and he is their commander in chief. Yeah. And that makes it a really different dynamic. If the commander in chief says, "I'm going to get in the limousine with 2 Secret Service guys, and I deem that it's safe, and we're just going to put masks on so I can go wave at the crowd," can some poor schnook many, many tiers down in the chain of command in active duty military say, "No, Mr. Commander-in-Chief, you cannot do that"?
What about the commander-in-chief referring to sign an NDA, Laurie? That seems a little over the top, given exactly the chain of command you're talking about.
Yeah. But Larry, we never had that before. I'm trying to think, because all the prior presidents I can remember who had a health problem, Eisenhower with his heart attack, LBJ with his cardiac and all that, they all had a private physician.
No, I don't think that's true.
Oh.
We've had military doctors that go way back. The private doctors that presidents have had that I can off the top of my head remember would be Bush 41, who had Bert Lee, who had been a New York City cancer specialist at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And then after, Reagan had a doctor selected by his son-in-law, who had been a former neurosurgical partner of his son-in-law. And he was an expert in spinal cord injuries and was a very well-known neurosurgeon and probably neurophysiologist as well. And he had the Reagan family persistence took the job for the first term, and he hated it. And he went back to his research and so forth. And he got caught up, that was Dan Ruge, and he got caught up in the problem that even though he knew the Constitution, carried the Constitution, a copy of the Constitution with him in the amendments, didn't think to raise the question of should we impose the 25th Amendment when Reagan had been shot 3 or 4 months after he took office. And Reagan's next doctor was a civilian, from a urologist from Los Angeles. And then he went to military doctors when the urologist ran into all sorts of problems in the White House and returned to LA, and he went to a military physician. Eisenhower had military physicians.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for a civilian physician to become a White House doctor. They're going to have to abandon the practice that they've had up until the point of the election that elects their patient president and then takes over inauguration. They have to go through a lot of physical stress and maneuvers that are required for the active duty military that a lot of the doctors can't keep up with. And that may or may not eliminate them as a White House doctor, or they can work in conjunction. But it's not an easy thing to bring a civilian in. I mean, Bush 43 did bring his doctor, civilian doctor from Texas, who would come in as an advisor. And certainly Nancy Reagan saw to it that Mayo Clinic doctors either did the prostate surgery that he needed at the time or brought in consultants. And Lyndon Johnson went to the Mayo Clinic. He had a doctor there that he would consult with. But those are in elective situations. You're not going to go find a consultant physician that you're going to go travel with when you have COVID. You're going to have to bring the consultant to the White House to come in as an expert if that's what you need, or if the White House doctors and the team believe that they can handle it, they'll do it. They had a vast array of doctors there, and not one nurse.
What I remember, the two incidents that I was personally engaged in, one was that Dick Cheney had such a fragile heart that it was ruled that there could never be a moment while he was vice president where a crash cart was less than 100 yards away from him. So there had to always be somebody near Dick Cheney who was a medical personnel, knew how to use a crash cart, and could respond, whether it was a nurse or a doctor. And I was well aware, because at the time I was at the Council on Foreign Relations, and some of the medical personnel that were rotating through, because it required such intensive 24/7 monitoring of his heart, were NIH personnel who were at the National Institute's medical facility in Bethesda. And they told me, they said, hey, he's got paper. He's got a heart made out of paper. And they were always amazed that he managed to continue to function and so on. The other one was when Clinton was president. And of course, it was the great collapse had just occurred when Clinton came in of the Soviet Union. And Boris Yeltsin was running what remained of Russia and its immediate allied states. And there was just, tremendous concern that there would be a civil war. And they came very close to full out civil war at least twice during the time that Yeltsin was there. Famously, the moment when he climbed on top of a tank in front of the Kremlin. Well, during that period, of course, he was a drunk, and he had a million different things wrong with him physically, but his heart was just, he needed quaternary bypass surgery, if I recall. And it was Clinton's decision that it was too dangerous to get him off Russian soil, that the moment Yeltsin physically left Russia, there would be a coup. And so they took the entire Johns Hopkins Cardiac Center, made basically a photocopy of it, got the same contractors, everything, went to the Kremlin and built it inside the Kremlin hospital so that it was like the Johns Hopkins Treatment Center for cardiac surgery. And then every American surgeon and nurse stood side by side with a Russian surgeon or nurse for the entire surgical procedure and post-op. And to this day, that is the treasured place to have your care if you're part of the Russian elite, to go into that Hopkins mimicked facility.
So I'd like
I think, Laurie, that there's a lot of fiction in what you just said.
What?
Yes.
Why?
Yeltsin, who refused to leave Russia because he wanted to be operated on and taken care of in Russia and didn't want to leave. He, by a certain coincidence, DeBakey was attending a cardiology conference in honor of a cardiac surgeon in Moscow, and was asked, because he was coming there and was highly respected in Russia. His textbook had been translated into Russian, and he spoke. He consulted on Yeltsin's case, and I was there and got the interview with Yeltsin in Moscow about what was happening, and they had brought a team from Houston, which is not Johns Hopkins.
Oh, okay, Houston.
To a hospital that the Russians had created that was a cardiology center. And that's where Yeltsin was taken care of. And I went in and did a story about the surgeon who was about to do Yeltsin surgery, doing a coronary bypass on another patient in that hospital. And it was the DeBakey team had to bring some equipment with them because they wanted to have the backup in case Yeltsin couldn't come off the pump after the coronary bypass procedure, in the midst of the procedure, but after they had shocked the heart. And they didn't need to use it, and DeBakey was in the gallery watching it, as were some of the other doctors on the team from Houston that came there. And Yeltsin recovered. Yeltsin later traveled and saw doctors elsewhere, but that was after he was president.
But Larry, can I ask you, in all of this history, are you familiar with another president besides the sitting one who required any of these doctors to sign an NDA about the treatment? Because that really struck me, not in the current COVID treatment, but previously when he went to Walter Reed, that I wasn't aware of that happening before. And with your very in-depth knowledge of medical treatment of presidents, I'm wondering if any of these earlier presidents invoked that same sort of precautionary measure.
They may have. It may have been in writing. It may have been just oral. And we don't know. Okay. Because we don't know the conversations that occurred between the president and the president's doctors. The doctors may have talked about it later. The president may have talked about it later. Neither of them may have talked about it, and yet it had been done.
Can I ask another question?
Between the president and vice president as to what will be done in case the president is incapacitated and what some of the ground rules would be. But I don't think that comes under there may be an NDA part of that as to what would be disclosed publicly, but that agreement between the president and vice president is something that's gone on. I don't know if it's happened between Trump and Pence, but it's gone on with previous presidents and their vice presidents from about Bush 41 times on.
Okay.
Not sure which was the first.
Let me ask you two other.
There was the Nixon and when Eisenhower had his heart attack, Eisenhower had written a letter to Nixon, and that was a guiding fact in terms of how to take care of him. But
two other questions like that Deb asked. One is, has any other president cited HIPAA or had their medical personnel cite HIPAA as a reason not to give information about the president's status? And number two, has any other president, while serving as president, received unlicensed, fully experimental medicine that we know of?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question.
First of all, HIPAA was passed, I guess, somewhere around the...
Donna Shalala. Donna Shalala has proudly told the world she wrote HIPAA.
So, right.
Yeah. That'd be clear.
We don't know what went on before HIPAA. And HIPAA doesn't prevent you from giving your own medical information. And this has been said over and over again, and yet it's thrown up as a screen over and over again. I don't recall that ever being brought up in the words of HIPAA and citing the legislation of HIPAA. It's been brought up by the campaign staffs and so forth that HIPAA applies to the president as it would or vice president or congressman or whoever, because it would. It covers a private citizen, and there's no requirement that a president on down has to disclose his or her health. It's become a custom, and it should be, but it's not based in law.
Kind of like taxes.
Yeah.
Same thing. It's a custom. It's
precisely. It's the same person who defied it on both levels.
There's another facet here I'd love to broach, which is articulated by the president.
Can you tell us about experimental therapy?
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I don't recall any off the top of my head. If they were done, it might not have been known. Nixon took an anti-epilepsy drug. I've forgotten the name of it. That one of his friends had brought him, and he believed it helped. I guess it would have been an off-label use, but it was a licensed drug or marketed drug.
Was it Tegretol?
No.
No. Senior moments. It's a long time ago.
It was. I don't think I've thought about it since then.
There's one other aspect, Larry, I would just want to get to, and I don't want to cut this short, but I want to be sure we have time to explore a couple other facets of it, and we can get back to that stuff. One is the other thing that Trump has been doing in a pandemic is trying to undercut the press's, the public's confidence in the press. Just today on the Limbaugh show, he says, and I'm not sure if this will work, but I'll try to play it.
You don't hear about any of this stuff. They don't want to talk about it.
I don't know if you can hear
But
that.
I'll tell you the amazing thing, the one thing I really have learned, the people of our country are smarter than the people that cover them.
He says the people of the country are smarter than the people who cover them. And he's trying to build this wall between the public, or at least his public, and the press. I don't know whether that's been, when issues like this have come up before, a president dealing with whether it's a pandemic, or you can even look at 9/11, how much of the focus of the president is literally on making sure the press is as eviscerated as possible in its capacity to convey risk to the public. Deborah, it would be good to hear from you on this, because a lot of what you're working on at MIT, at the Science Journalism Center, is like the frontiers of science journalism. And here we are in this online environment that's so different than what it was like. So maybe each of you could weigh in, starting with Deborah, on how big a deal that is in the context of getting out of this mess.
I don't think that this particular approach by President Trump is anything new in his administration. I think from the beginning he's been trying to undermine what he calls the lamestream press, or actual independent smart journalism, trying to convey reality to the general public. And I think he's done that not only with the COVID pandemic, but in many other issues, sometimes more effectively than others. But I think this is an ongoing strategy of his. We see it more as science journalists in the middle of a pandemic that's killed more than 200,000 Americans without any acknowledgement of that, or any honesty about the way the government is dealing with that pandemic from the government. And it works effectively with some of his audience. And just to give you a specific example of that, I'm by marriage, I'm related to a lot of people from the San Joaquin Valley of California, which is the red state part of California, as Laurie, I can see you nodding, knows. And they're largely President Trump supporters, and they will go on rants about the scumbag media and the problem with smart people, right? And so one of the other things, aside from undermining the press, that Trump has done very effectively with that particular base is undermine trust in what in experts or in scientists who actually can give you accurate information. And you heard him playing to that just now in that clip you played, Andy. That my base, are smarter than the press, or smarter than the experts. And that's like magic fairy food for those guys, right? They hate being talked down to. They feel that experts and journalists think they're stupid. I hear this from, one of my family members in the San Joaquin Valley, the hatred of smart people. So I don't think this is anything new in its toolbox, but I think it does a lot of harm to all of us in the pandemic, for sure.
Especially with social media in the mix. Remember, Twitter has only existed meaningfully for 10 years, if that, not even. So
Yeah.
it's like,
Right, that's amplified what I agree with Deborah that this has been going on for a long time. It's just the technology has changed it logarithmically, and you now have social media, Twitter, and so forth.
And you also have
the name of the drug that I couldn't think of was Dilantin.
oh, right.
Oh, I know Dilantin.
Yeah, my brother was on Dilantin. I know it well.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that people can live in their separate bubbles on the internet. I mean, it's social media, but it's also that everyone gets to cherry pick the information they're getting. And so the wonderful old serendipity of everyone tuning into a network, or everyone reading the New York Times or another paper, a lot of us, right?
But one of the things that when I was working on my second book, Betrayal of Trust, one of the things that was a consistent finding, and you go through history, the history of the post-germ theory era when real public health gets built, is that anti-governmentalism and anti-public health messaging go hand in hand. Yeah. So in periods when the general public trusts, the majority of public trusts government, or at least admires their leaders to some degree, you have a higher level of trust in public health. The classic example is 1947 New York, when a traveler from Mexico, a tourist, went to all the classic tourist sites of New York City carrying smallpox. And at that time, the woman who was the commissioner of health was also a very popular radio broadcaster. She had a regular show. The whole city would tune in to find out how's our health, basically. And she said on her radio show, everybody has to get vaccinated. And in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, they vaccinated almost the entire population of New York. They had the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, all these different volunteer groups involved, the community chest. It was a time post-World War II when Americans felt great about being American, and their government had created victory in World War II and prosperity, and they trusted the leadership. And today we have the exact opposite. we have a nation where we're, as you were saying, the San Joaquin Valley versus Los Angeles, but it's a nation divided in such fundamental ways that anything to do with government is immediately polarizing. Mm-hmm. And public health, like it or not, is a government function. And also I cannot, in all my years of covering epidemics, I cannot recall any time when the CDC was so thoroughly sidelined.
I was just going to ask about.
Think about this. We're accustomed to covering epidemics where there's daily briefings, where we all have to, as reporters, rearrange our lives to be available for the daily phone briefing, or sometimes several times a day. When did they set up the Special Operations Center? I'm trying to think which outbreak that was.
It was SARS.
SARS, 2003. And since then, we were accustomed to having briefings right from the floor, and seeing the numbers counts on the walls, and seeing the desks where somebody's talking to the governors and somebody's doing supply chain, and on and on and on throughout this big hall. And now, zero. Nothing. Wall of silence. And even knowing, some of us have been informed that we are on a blacklist, and that they've been specifically telling their press office, these reporters you cannot speak to. These reporters know inside it, the chain of command says no, they cannot get in. And I can't even remember a time like that.
And that's true with the FDA too, Laurie, right? You've seen the same kind of undermining of the credibility of the FDA in tandem with the CDC, which is really bad news for any kind of vaccine trust in vaccines going forward.
Actually, let's talk about the vaccine debate. It's been so interesting. Laurie was on here twice to talk about vaccine confidence and the challenges. And now the Trump message has flipped the script. He's calling Democrats anti-vaxxers because they're not willing to push for speedy release of a vaccine. That caught me by surprise, actually. Laurie, I don't know about whether that flip had you thought of that might come, where they could actually become like the pro-vaxxers?
All along, his fantasy of several thousand people in a photo op with MAGA hats on with their sleeves rolled up would never happen. The MAGA hat and sleeve rolled up do not go together.
Yeah.
And they just don't. And for him to turn around and say that the Democrats are anti-vaccine it's like saying, I don't know, I can't even come up with an example. It's so ludicrous. Of course, the Democrats, because of the government split, are less trusting of current government, and therefore current government accreditation process, the likelihood of something rushed through before November 3rd being safe. I think, look, you'd be hard pressed to find a science journalist. Forget Democrat, forget Republican. Find a science journalist that would say, we can see a path to a thoroughly safe, effective vaccine in the next 26 days.
Yeah. And there's some pushback from the pharmaceutical companies themselves, Laurie. Yeah, I don't think they want to be in the position of being forced to rush out.
Hell no. Actually, the 9 leading pharmaceutical manufacturers that have the front of the queue vaccines at this moment have all said we will not be pressured into a stampede. And even the top scientists within the FDA, led by Peter Marks, have said we will not carry out a stampede. So I think the White House has probably given up at this point. They should have at any rate. But to go to your point, the vaccine confidence issue, any whisper, any hint that steps have been bypassed for the sake of rushing and that there might be safety issues will kill any attempt to mass vaccinate the American people. Just dead like that. And what I'm hearing from the manufacturers, their concern is even a whole other layer, which is rarely talked about. And that is, even if they have a safe product, absolutely no Guillain-Barré syndrome, no contamination issues, no cutter incident, right? They have a truly safe product. Their concern is that it might not be a terribly effective product. That they might be putting something out that only has, in real world use, not ideal clinical trial use, only has, say, a 40% efficacy rate. In which case, are they to be held liable for the 60% who misbehave thinking they're protected, acquire COVID, and die, or are at risk of death?
I mean, when I talk to friends of mine who also follow this, like Helen Brownswell at STAT, she says she hasn't heard anyone say, yes, we have a vaccine in the pipeline that is going to generate sterilizing immunity. Right. And I think that's a reality check that we all have to deal with. And that I don't know that the American public, in the state of mistrust it's in now, is going to know how to sort of rationally work their way through that question of how much coverage they're going to get from that vaccine.
And that, that's an interesting one. Probably, Larry, you know more about this than I, but it's an interesting one to look at historically because, most of us received the Salk vaccine for our polio immunization when we were youngsters. And then along came the Sabin vaccine, which was oral. So the Salk was injected oral. One was meant to protect the individual. The other would have been truly sterilizing so that the individual could not be a carrier with polio in their GI tract, passing it through feces, right? And so this became a real bone of contention. And of course, a war that went on until they died between Salk and Sabin. I think the only time they ever appeared together in solidarity was that horrible swine flu mess in 1976. But other than that, and that continues to play out even now in controversies over how best to vaccinate in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the last two places with polio, and the rise of vaccine-derived polio in parts of Africa now and the Middle East. But you're absolutely right. No, I don't know of any product of the roughly 250 in the pipeline right now for SARS-CoV-2. I don't know of any that claims that they're on the path to sterilizing immunity. And this is a virus that we know asymptomatic individuals and certainly symptomatic can shed.
Right.
So that's a real issue.
So many real issues.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, and the vaccines that were done against the so-called childhood diseases in the past were done at much more deliberate speed. There were ones that were developed and failed. They weren't marketed until there was much more confidence in them. And this is being done warp speed. In the negative part of that, we'll take all our chances with it just to get it done. And let's not talk about the potential consequences of that.
Were you surprised? And I think of this as me being naive when COVID-19 first came up and we started talking about a vaccine. I thought, okay, this is totally going to roll over the anti-vax movement because it's going to be so obvious to everyone that we need a vaccine to get a handle on this and return the country to normal. But it seems that the opposite has happened and that the anti-vax movement is in fact powered up. And were you surprised by that? I was, but obviously I'm not as clued in as you are.
Because it's the same thing we were talking about before, the anti-government sentiment. And so the whole idea of scaling everybody up for mass vaccination fed right into the, but government this, but government that. And immediately you've seen an alliance between the anti-vaccine forces generally and the COVID suspect, conspiracies. And then, but the permutation that is unprecedented, as far as I can tell, is the claim, which is all over the Reddit chat rooms and the deep web stuff, that Bill Gates himself
somehow
created this epidemic in order to cause a mass vaccination of the entire planet with hidden nano devices for tracking human beings so that Microsoft will rule the planet. Blah, 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 blah. And it's right up there with a whole lot of Europeans claiming that there's no such thing as COVID. It's all 5G tech. And I don't know how 5G transmitters are supposed to give you an acute pulmonary disease with massive cardiovascular ramifications, but there you go.
Yeah. So let's focus a little bit on the what some now call solutions journalism. What are the, other than telling a traditional story like most of us did for most of our careers, is there a role for journalism in directly enabling communities to navigate toward information that can help them reduce risk, for example, tools, or this is journalism and partners, whether it's the kinds of things the Journalism School of Columbia has been doing that we're trying to integrate a little bit of science into the newsroom to look at hotspots like heat effects in relation to climate extremes. I mean, in relation to mortality rates and stuff. And on this pandemic we're in and won't be out of anytime soon, is it enough to just tell stories, or what else comes to mind, and what else are you working on? Laurie, you're very much a storyteller, but you've been involved in as an educator too, and you talk to students. And Deborah, for sure, you have this year. I think you're skipping your fellowships, but you have journalists come to the campus every year to spend time with scientists and figure out new approaches to navigating. And Larry, we could talk about this too. But so what is it we're not doing as journalists or journalism or enterprises that we might be thinking about doing, given this multi-layered challenge?
I actually think that journalism is really good. I mean, by and large, spectacular, interactive, informative, daily updated stuff on websites of the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, and so on. I mean, the amount of coverage and the density of it is astounding. There must be at least 20 people at the Washington Post covering some aspect of COVID every day. And the Times is pretty much the same. And I don't think that I would say there's any great gap, nor do I think that there's been any tremendous mistake made, that some journalistic outlet has gotten it wildly wrong in some way. I'm speaking now, of course, about mainstream journalism. And even on Twitter, perhaps it reflects who I follow, but I don't really see a lot of mistakes being made. And when they are made, if they're made by either a scientist or a journalist, they generally do an immediate retraction, an apology, and they don't just erase it. They tell you, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Now I'm erasing it. I'm deleting that thread. So actually, I would start, Andy, by saying I think that we've already seen a toolkit leveled against this virus that is unprecedented. I wish we'd had this kind of toolkit when Larry and I were covering HIV in May and June of 1981. But it was a handful of newspapers, right. And I was at NPR, and hardly anybody listened to NPR back then. And that was it,
Yeah. And one, actually, maybe I should reframe that question, which is like, what are you seeing that excites you? And you've just been describing. I do think, like, when Alexis Madrigal and others launched the COVID-19 tracker, for example, that feels like exactly the kind of thing you.
Oh, and you can see things. Look, if let's say what you're interested in is the virus mutating, you can see websites now that are tracking in real time fully sequenced viruses. We've now got more than 100,000 of them fully sequenced, and you can go and boom, 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 and you can see what mutations are happening, and boom, 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 it's all public. You want to know, what's the latest case report numbers from Algeria? There's 100 different places to go to get accurate numbers right now. We didn't have any of this kind of stuff, even in 2009 with H1N1. This is unprecedented.
Can I yes, but we're really talking about major publications, the Atlantic, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the kind of urban educated audiences that we see largely reading those papers. But if you go out further across the United States, and certainly into areas that are sort of hotbeds of mask resistance, those people aren't necessarily looking at it.
Well,
they're not getting the kind of information you're talking to. This is actually, and I should say quickly, Andy, we have a remote fellowship program this year, but we have a program. So instead of bringing people to the team, we just put as much money as we could into supporting journalists around the United States doing different projects. Some of them are COVID projects. But the other thing we've been doing is trying to raise the bar on science reporting in small and regional markets.
Right.
We have a whole series of projects that we're doing to try to improve science editing at small newspapers and small publications. Places from the Alabama Political Reporter, Southerly, to actually the very good Charlotte, South Carolina paper. And I think one of the things we have to think about when we're thinking about our toolkit is how do we get more of this out into these other parts of the country and out to these different audiences. So I'm always excited. I saw ProPublica just announced, further partnerships in states around the country, and I'm always excited when we start seeing really smart journalists move into those.
Yeah, sort of that the replication process where you can. I was at ProPublica when they launched that distributed newsroom effort, and I think it's a fantastic model.
What you've been focusing on, though, is print journalism.
True.
Yeah.
And the overwhelming majority of Americans get their news from television and or social media.
Social media.
Okay, but
if they're under 40, TV is meaningless.
Right.
Well, I don't know how meaningless it is, but what concerns me is I don't think the resources. I don't watch much television because I don't have the time to.
Yeah.
But I don't think that television is the networks and so forth have been able to put the human power in it to cover COVID as extensively as the print media has put its resources into it. Maybe
and here's a classic. Let's look at the homepage of Fox News right now, which is about. I saw this happening yesterday or the day before. The efforts, the 25th Amendment questions around Trump, they've pivoted. I think it's Kevin McCarthy in Congress is now trying to use a similar tactic, claiming that Pelosi has lost her mind. So, and this is what you see on Fox right now. White House hits back. Trump and others question Pelosi's mental fitness as she suggests president may not be fit for office. So you end up in this weird, bizarro world again. Boy, that's a tough nut to crack.
Well, Andy, every time I've been on your show, we've ended up at the same point, which is that the public is not. We don't have a Walter Cronkite world anymore, where the mass consensus of what is truth for the day is agreed upon because everybody's watching the same voice of God. Cronkite's actual remote license plate number was VOG, Voice of God. And that day is gone. And so, half the planet that we know, half the Americans are watching Fox and half are at MSNBC or CNN. And so we have different definitions of truth. So when you ask us, and whether it's, in small town Wyoming or it's in the middle of New York City, there's a split in what people go to as source to begin with.
Right.
So, Deb can do incredible teaching and support amazing programs all over the country to try and improve the quality of science reporting, but that's not going to show up on Fox. And that's not going to show up in those Reddit accounts. And it sure isn't going to show up on some of those websites that Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck and Laura Ingraham and, on and on, Sean Hannity, the websites they use as their go-to sources and that the president himself retweets from constantly.
Yes, and that's a daunting problem, isn't it?
Yes.
I think part of the problem on a broader, looking at it on a broader level and going back, not just in COVID, but going back certainly in HIV/AIDS and in others beforehand, is the public health community and the medical profession, when they talk to the public, do a horrible job.
Terrible.
They talk in jargon.
Yeah.
They don't try to listen to what the listeners want to hear. And it starts from I don't know exactly why it is. It may be from the days when medicine was a priesthood and so forth. That's always brought in as a reason. I'm not sure that that's the answer, but it tells you how poorly they communicate with patients on an everyday basis, independent of a public health threat or issue. And it's a real problem that's gone on for centuries and decades. I mean, in HIV/AIDS, it was bodily fluids, but then they wouldn't explain what bodily fluids were. And it was up to the newspapers. And then the newspapers trying to do it, well, a lot of their editors didn't want to move into that territory.
Don't you dare say the word sperm. Ah!
Yeah. I mean, it's been a real problem, and it still exists today.
Now, this is where I do ask the question that's led me not to be at the journalism school at Columbia, but to be at the Earth Institute, looking at the information landscape more widely. And I want to show you something that gives me encouragement, which is Bob Wachter and others who have become these very public communicators of medical risk and solutions. And their social media presence has grown enormously. Now, I think they still do suffer from, mostly they're talking to those who are already progressive or informed, but they are talking a lot, and then they end up in CNN, like Bob Hotez, who was almost going to be on the show today.
Peter Hotez, yeah.
Peter Hotez.
But Andy, I mean, Wachter is exceptional because he runs the whole Department of Medicine of one of the most prestigious and powerful medical schools in America, UC San Francisco. He's actually ordered that the grand rounds inside the medical school, the grand rounds that are about COVID, are online in real time for the whole world to watch.
That's amazing.
I mean, how many medical schools or hospitals have done such a thing? But that's an unusual and exceptional. And frankly, while I'm really glad to see that happening, and I think Larry's point is true that a lot of people in public health, and especially MDs in public health, are lousy communicators and use jargon and acronyms when, most of the audience has no idea what they're talking about. But this epidemic, what we're seeing is a very different problem, I think, as the number one crisis. And that is, since we have no federal leadership and no CDC leadership, every single locality in America is making up their own set of facts and their own set of policy and their own set of, who should be scared and who shouldn't. The president says, hey, it infects hardly anybody. He said that just 1 week before he announced that he had it. And so the result is that we're seeing public health commissioners and leaders all around the country getting fired or getting muzzled. And instead, it's the mayor saying this is scientific reality. It's the governor saying this is scientific reality. And it's local business interests saying, we reject all of that and we like Sweden. We want to stop all social distancing because we're losing money. And so the real problem I see is that we're witnessing what happens when the CDC is no longer considered a voice of truth and leadership. And
there's no national standard, right?
Yeah, we have this mess.
And going back to this particular doctors as public communicators, I have a good friend here in Boston, Jeremy Faust, who's at Brigham and Women. Right. And he also has been very active in trying to get accurate information out there. He's been on a lot of TV shows. He started Brief 19 to kind of analyze the, what in a public way, what's accurate about the research into COVID. But he hasn't gone on Hannity or Fox or, done an interview with Breitbart. He's gone to all the, the usual places, CNN and NBC and MSNBC. And so you don't see that kind of information.
Bill Hasseltine does.
Yes, that's
Bill
exactly
Hasseltine,
right.
who we all know well, who used to be at the big Boston hospital.
Oh
My God.
That,
But you mean Mass General or Brigham and
Farber. He used to be at Dana-Farber in Boston, and then he founded his own biotech companies, one after another. And he has been very much going on Fox, trying to balance the craziness on Fox. But he was shoved aside when Scott Atlas became a prominent voice on Fox. And then the president spots him and brings him in. And now Scott Atlas is in the driver's seat running our COVID response on the national level.
And he has no background in infectious disease.
He's a radiologist
Yes.
who hung up his shingle, and he's a Hoover Institute pundit.
But I'm not defending him or promoting him, but from what I've been able to learn and read, he has put 2 or 3 or 4 years into public policy studying at the Hoover Institute.
Right.
And while we may not agree with it, I don't see anything wrong with people coming from any specialty of medicine and trying to get into a public policy issue. I would encourage that. I don't happen to agree with the outcome here, but I don't think we can just say, oh, because he's a radiologist, he doesn't know what he's talking about. If he was a radiologist and didn't study public policy, it would be a stronger case.
Do you have an example of someone who was a public health policy person, maybe his background or her background didn't exactly match the science, who did an outstanding job then?
Chick Coop, I have to think this through. He was a pediatrician. They're often involved with infectious diseases. But for the most part, HIV/AIDS wasn't a pediatric disease when he was Surgeon General. They certainly were at risk. I'm not trying to minimize that. And to my knowledge, he wasn't in infectious diseases. He was a surgeon. I'd have to think of more, but I'm sure there are others.
That's a good
What I have to do is just think a little bit more in the history.
I think in the case of C. Everett Koop, the difference was that he may have been brought in to be Surgeon General because he supported right to life and was anti-abortion. He may have been a pediatric surgeon, but the unexpected surprise to the right that advocated for him to be Surgeon General was that he was humane and that he actually cared about whether or not people needlessly died and suffered. And he saw HIV/AIDS and the suffering and the dying. He was on the wards, and he realized that he had to take steps that differed from what the president wanted him to do. And, that's an interesting thing also to think about, is that before C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General was a powerful position and certainly was the big bully pulpit, if you will, of American public health and medicine. And because C. Everett Koop did the national mailing informing the American people about this danger of HIV/AIDS in a humane tone that didn't say, lock up all the homosexuals or some similarly horrible thing, there has been since him a steady degradation of the role of the Surgeon General and the independence of the office of the Surgeon General, to the point where I don't think the average American could possibly name the last 3 Surgeon Generals in America, or even has any idea what a Surgeon General is.
Yeah, but you got to go back and ask why. And that goes back, I think it was Johnson, I'm not sure who, but turned the position of the Surgeon General of the United States from the Public Health Service. There are I think there are 4 or 5 Surgeon Generals of the United States. The rest are in military. But the one that people talk about is the one who used to come from the Public Health Service. It may still come from the Public Health Service.
Where's the uniform?
But that's because Johnson, if it was Johnson, whoever was the president who did this, took away the power of the position of the Surgeon General and made that the deputy in those days HEW secretary, and made it a political position. So the politicalization of the Public Health Service, in the sense I'm talking about, is not brand new. It was there before. If you want to call taking away the power of one position and turning it over to the power of the politic, it depends on definitions. And I've forgotten which president did it. I think it was Johnson, but I don't want to hold to that.
But the last Surgeon General that actually was a household name was C. Everett Koop.
I agree.
Yeah. That sounds like something to put on a to-do list. I'm making a little to-do list here of, I don't know, if Biden wins, what are the steps that could be taken realistically to rationalize the information landscape around this pandemic that would reach out, as Biden claims he wants to do. He wants to lead all of America, not just the progressive liberal America. So maybe we could wrap things up in the next few minutes. We're running a little long, which I don't mind at all. This is a rare opportunity to have a couple of Pulitzer Prize winners and Larry Altman in my living room. But what would be on that list? So elevating the Surgeon General sounds valuable. Obviously, the CDC. But what if Biden wins and is serious about leading America through this, beyond this pandemic, in a way that reaches out? What would that look like?
Well,
I want to see it independent.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to say the thing that is universally being clamored for among the COVID anxious and public health leadership is that we need to really develop some uniform standards, because, for example, all the tests that are out there are not quantifiably analogous to one another. We don't know the reliability of one test compared to another test. We need standardization of testing. We need standardization of measurements of the efficacy of vaccines. Right now, every single company has invented their own standards by which they're measuring their particular vaccine. And once we have 4 or 5 or 6 reasonable vaccines, we'll need to be able to cross-measure which are the better ones. Similarly, on policy interventions and social distancing, on masks and the reliability of any given type of mask in a different type of setting. We can go through a huge list of things that are measures that individuals can take, schools or businesses can take, and so on. And we have no standardization of policies based on science. And I think right there, that's the step everybody's waiting for and believes that a Biden administration would do right away. And then, of course, to do that, you have to re-elevate now dormant elements of the CDC and inside HHS, a variety of different offices. And then I think there's a real clamoring to have all the holes that currently exist in our data tracking filled immediately. There's been some rather deliberate attempts, particularly when the White House brought in Palantir to take over all tracking of hospitalizations for COVID, that we actually have not only a big lag in reporting, but huge gaps. I mean, whole sets of hospitals are simply not reporting data anymore. And that had a lot to do with stripping the CDC from control of data regarding COVID. And without better data, we don't know what's working and not working. And we don't know anything about clusters. So if you look at Japan, they have a case fatality rate that's half of ours. And they have a new case per 100,000 that's about 1.2. compared to ours being 63.5 on any given measurement period you look at. So the key reason is they do instant cluster analysis. And as soon as a case appears somewhere, they isolate and identify the full cluster around that case, put people in voluntary isolation, and start testing boom, 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 boom really fast, and figure out how far does that cluster go. And we have no real capacity for that or implementation for that almost anywhere in the United States. Some isolated pockets of health departments are pulling that off, but that's all it is. So those would be the first really big. And then, of course, as a big part of that, we need consistent messaging, which means, back to when Larry was running MMWR, or when we had consistent voicing and messaging that either came out of the CDC or out of NIH or out of the Office of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. But right now, we just have message chaos, absolute chaos. And it's left to the journalists to decide what should be the message today, because they're not going to get it consistently from government.
And that issue of what journalists do and how they react is still unresolved. Months into this, Jay Rosen at NYU, a longtime journalism critic and analyst, said we're in a civic emergency, and journalism as we know it doesn't have the norms to deal with what we're facing around the Trump propaganda style, endless lies. As he said, that it was 16,000 lies then, I think it's 25,000 now. And here now, we have another theatrical event coming up. This is breaking news. Trump is going to have a medical examination on Fox News live.
Oh my God.
Tonight.
What I think too.
Oh my God, this is going to be live television med exam. Who's going to
hopefully ask him to strip entirely?
bend over and cough? Wait, who's going to do this exam?
Well, we could find out. I can click and look, but it's I saw something a little while ago about this. He was diagnosed with a medical examination on Tucker Carlson's show. Mark Spiegel. So tell us about Mark Spiegel. Oh, right, Mark Spiegel. Right. Duh.
He goes back to HIV days. This is a guy who's been around on the right-wing periphery for a very long time. He was at one point an HIV denier. He's Fox's, medical expert. He's the Sanjay Gupta of Fox. Poor Sanjay. That's a bad comparison.
Yeah, but I know what you mean. Well, this is kind of surreal, but this is the Trump way. He had cameras on his flight from Walter Reed. He did his little stand-up routine there on the balcony.
He was a big proponent of hydroxychloroquine, by the way.
I know. I noticed he didn't take it. At least we don't know that.
No, Mark Siegel was.
Oh, Mark Siegel was.
He was really pushing it hard.
So are we basically just screwed? Is this? It feels like we're always behind in terms of figure out how to cover these kinds of things, with the divisions in the way people consume media. Larry, you and I we all grew up in the day of, as you were saying earlier, the Walter Cronkite. That's the way it is, Unitarian view, which had its own problems, but it feels like there's
I think
so much work to do.
What this is all about is the president wants to hold rallies between now and election day. He can't win if they do, an online virtual debate, and that's his last public appearance.
Right.
And he needs someone to say, you can defy the CDC edict that you have to be symptom-free, and then 14 days after that, still isolated, to ensure that you're protecting the public from you, others around you from you, that you're not spreading disease. He needs someone to certify that it's okay for him. He's disease-free. He's not a danger to others. He can go out and go on the campaign trail, shake hands all over America, and all have another Sturgis rally with, maybe 250,000 bikers will come into the San Joaquin Valley for a big rally.
Yeah, that would be. But don't you think, Laurie, this is also about picking a very selective audience who's actually going to believe this, right?
Of course. Do you think NBC News would have sponsored this? Do you think CNN would have done this? This is a stunt.
Yes.
But Sanjay Gupta would definitely give him a checkup if you'd let him. Well, I don't know. Maybe he wouldn't, because then he would determine his lung capacity and
But
everything.
he wouldn't do it live. He wouldn't say,
No, I know.
come on, Larry,
It's a stunt.
the kinds of tests you would have to do to certify that the president was completely disease-free, no active virus in him, and healthy and robust and not a danger to others as well as to himself. You couldn't do all that live on camera in 5 minutes.
Well, it depends how much time they give him, but assuming they give him all the time that Dr. Siegel would need, you'd want a nasal swab. You'd and maybe they'll do that and then tell you the results of the test, which would be instructive in a way, because if he was still positive, it would be hard to keep on holding public rallies or having people work around him in the White House if you believe the results of the test. If he was negative, it would buoy his contention that he's over the infection.
Wow.
Who knows? Maybe he'll find things that the White House doctors haven't disclosed to us that Dr. Siegel will be smart enough to be able to find out. I doubt it.
Well, they're claiming he has antibodies, but they, of course, have no capacity to tell whether they're the Regeneron monoclonal antibodies or that his body is making neutralizing antibodies.
Right. Well, I was going to go on with he could withdraw blood for tests and specify which tests he would order and where they would be done. Although on the president, I'm not sure you could do it that way. It's for show. I mean, this is Trump's genius from the point of view of how to control the press, the information, and to be the center of attention. And people have just paid too little attention to what has made him so, quote, successful, unquote, in garnering votes to be elected president.
One of the things that Laurie said.
This is very deceptive. Under Mark Siegel's official Twitter biography, medical director, but if you have to read down to realize he's talking about director of a radio broadcast.
Oh, I know. Well, and author of a book he's trying to sell.
If you look up way back when the Pope was dying, and the Pope had, I think it was a urinary tract infection. He had some minor problem. Mark Siegel was writing for a wire service and said, "Oh, this is nothing. He'll be fine tomorrow." And the next day, the Pope died.
Interesting.
I think you can go back and find that.
I'll look it up. Yeah, I'm actually seeing it right here. Well, boy, it just shows you there's a lot of work to be done. Laurie, there was one last thought I had that goes back to something you said here in giving advice to journalists on April 1st. We were talking to journalists in India mainly, but it's just as true in Indiana. One way around this is to cover the story right around you, meaning every journalist in America, whether you're at a tiny radio station in Podunk or up here in the Hudson Valley, or whether you're in a major city, you have access to the story of our lives, which is the story of this pandemic, which has affected everyone, even my 88-year-old mother-in-law in rural Maine, who ended up knowing that the parent of one of the people who was at that wedding in Maine that got some headlines, who died. And so this reached all the tendrils of this are everywhere. And the story is everywhere. The story, if you want to make it about Trump, that'll always be there. But maybe it's just the magic of a P.T. Barnum is the distraction, is to take the story, control of the story when it's really all around us. And the tragedy and challenge is ultimately, unlike climate change, this is the story where your local actions actually hugely matter. And maybe that's a way to flip it. I don't know.
There's one thing that journalists could do, and that is to push for and repeatedly go after the fact that they have not done contact tracing in the outbreak from the White House, which
I know,
which looks like long distance looks like a super spreader event, but they need to do that to keep that issue alive. And I've wrestled with this in my own mind. what is it that journalists could do through graphics, follow-up?
It's done. Actually, there are several websites right now that are in real time tracking the Rose Garden distribution.
Oh,
You can go on day by day. They know where everybody sat. They circle each one as they test positive. They also know who was in the offices. See, this is a perfect epi study because it's all on film. You know, we know exactly what time somebody went into a private meeting with Trump or a private meeting with Coney Barrett and so on.
Laurie, but what I'm trying to get at is that's one thing. That's the graphic, the photograph. Can they identify those individuals in them, whether they were positive or negative, and then, in essence, become contact tracers themselves as reporters?
Well, there's the
they go beyond the standard ethics of journalism, which Deborah can address, because there's a limit of where you go in terms of being a journalist. And on the other hand, I can see that that's a very good thing that journalists could be doing.
Well, right now, some of that is happening. For example, the Bedminster meeting. So after the Rose Garden, the president flew to Duluth, then he flew to another place in Minnesota, and then the debate, and then he came back and he went to New Jersey to Bedminster to his golf club, and all of this was fundraising. And in two of those gatherings, he was in small, intimate, wealthy people's homes with invited guests who paid, huge amounts to be there with the president in intimate settings. So, yes, many different news organizations have asked, who was in this room with the president in Bedminster? Who was in the room here? Who's in the room there? And some of it has been tracked. For example, WNYC, the NPR station in New York and New Jersey, has been tracking the Bedminster group. There's some real serious work getting done in Minnesota journalists. The problem is, as it turns out, that not only the journalists are experiencing, but also the local health departments, is a refusal by the Trump supporters to supply the names and the test results to them. And so there's a real obfuscation going on that makes it difficult to do what you're suggesting.
That's an obstacle that shouldn't stop it. That's an obstacle you got to work on to overcome and find out the tests, because some of the refuseniks may end up having it, and possibly they may change their mind.
There's a LinkedIn comment that came in proposing kind of an IPCC panel style approach to COVID-19. It says, what about setting a global independent panel of scientists on COVID-19 in order to obtain a more objective and centralized assessment of status of the situation, standards, and best practices? We are in a dire need of some uniform directives to deal with the pandemic collectively in a more rational manner.
Some of that has been done by the World Health Organization.
Right.
Some of what's suggested. They do have panels of experts set up from all over the world that have put out detailed statements about things like aerosol transmission, droplet transmission, standardization of practices and so on, best advice on treatment and so on. So that is happening. But of course, our government has decided that nothing from WHO is of value. As far as an independent group to do what Larry's suggesting and really conduct Epi 101 on this White House clear outbreak, which as of last night was 34 cases. I don't know what it would be up to now. And that's just around the White House. That's not including all the other places the president and his group went. That any suggestion of an independent assessment would be very difficult to pull off politically.
Yeah. In the meantime, they're stonewalling us here. In fact, there was a White House correspondent for the New York Times who tested positive, and
Four reporters have tested positive, and in the New York Times case, there's secondary transmission to spouse.
I didn't know that, and he was saying he was never contacted, by anyone from the White House in trying to trace this back because they don't want to trace it back.
Of course not. In fact, the president has now officially said, I don't think any of this happened in the Rose Garden. It was at an event with veterans. And he's blaming
our family
veterans for giving him COVID.
Oh, right. Right. They gave him the disease. Yes. What a wonderful thought. Well, boy, there's so much more to talk about. I know you're all working harder than we have ever worked. I know this, to try to navigate this and be effective as communicators. And Larry, I'm really looking forward to your book when that emerges on all the president's health and how that's been covered. It's just been a thrill to have you on the show today. I hope maybe we can reprise this. Maybe after the election, we can do a where do we go from here? Whatever happened conversation.
There's more to talk about.
Laurie Garrett.
We didn't even mention the fly.
Oh no, there's so many
of the fly. So I don't know how we got this far without it. But and Larry, thanks for correcting the fictions given to me by the Russians 2 years later.
And Deborah Blum, I assume you're working on another book too. Your books have been fabulous trips back in time to look at chemistry and toxicity and poisoning and all kinds of things.
I love science history, and it's been really great to learn more medical history from Larry and from Laurie today. Actually, this has been fascinating, so thanks.
And now
Deborah, are you going to do a book on the poisoning that the Russians have pulled on
Novichok.
Isn't that a fascinating story? So, yeah, that would be really interesting.
I thought the wildest one ever was the Bulgarian
Ryson,
who was killed by something on the tip of an umbrella.
Right?
It was Ryson
in the streets of Germany, and I thought, or London, wherever it was. Anyway, I thought that was the wildest. But Novichok,
and look, and not to forget the polonium poisoning, right? Which left radioactive trails off over half of Europe. So,
what do you think that book? What do you think that fly had on him and staying on Pence's head?
It was hairspray.
Yeah, maybe he was stuck.
Wow. And by the way, we all have to laugh a little bit. You know, we have to release this insanity inside us. It's just great to get together with friends like this. And
thank you.
As we try to chart a path forward. Just tell everyone that this is Sustain What you've been watching the last hour and a half. It's a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration and the great pause now that the COVID-19 pandemic has imposed on our species for the time being. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of this information environment that's connecting us, dividing us, confusing us, that's miraculous and can be terrible at the same time. How do we make it work better? That's what I try to work on. This is a part of my work building the Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends in circles far and wide. Get in touch with ideas. See the little scrolling bar that I forgot to put at the bottom of the picture so that you can see where we are. And what, that's how it works sometimes. And there you go. So that you can go back to this and find a way to get in touch with me with ideas for the show. Maybe we'll tune in tonight. I'll tune in tonight to watch live on Fox News as President Trump's health is inspected by Mark Siegel on live news. Maybe we'll have a follow-up show like Colbert and Trevor Noah do and see how that went. But thank you both. Thank you all for being here today. And maybe we can try again sometime soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay well, stay safe, connect from a distance. Bye-bye.
Bye, Larry. Bye, Deb.
Bye, Laurie. Bye.